Hi, I also wanted to show you how we can begin working with the Cinemachine FreeLook camera to create a very simple 3D over-the-shoulder camera for our games. And what we're going to do is, for anybody finding this outside of our class, we're going to build upon the stuff that we are doing already to move our player around the scene. And so this is by using a character controller that we're developing. And we're going to make some changes to one of the scripts that we'll talk about, and then we'll simply take a few steps into working with Cinemachine FreeLook. This is a wonderful way to be able to add this functionality. It's incredibly deep. We could dip into it and just create things which are very sensitive. In a 3D game in particular, the way that we see space, the way that we're directing the player's eye, and the way we're empowering them to be able to see the things we need them to see to play our games is incredibly important. And so having a tool like this to be able to leverage can really allow us to get to those places as game designers where we're thinking about the way that we're structuring this play rather than focusing so heavily on the technical. And so what we're going to do is I've already added Cinemachine from Unity's package manager. And I'm going to go to this now and create a FreeLook camera. This is the only one that we're interested in at this moment. And when we do this, Unity creates a Cinemachine FreeLook camera game object in our scene. This is where we're going to make all of our changes to influence our camera. And you can see already it's taken my camera in this space, it's taken it off of here, and it's put it in this place. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to reposition this camera and get it to look where we want to. But before we do that, we're going to make one other really critical change to the way that we've been setting up things so far. Now, notice next to our first-person camera here, that's a child of our player game object. It has a little icon next to it, which just lets us know that this camera is now connected to our Cinemachine game object. When we've created this game object, it's looked through our scene for a camera and attached a Cinemachine brain component to it. What this is really going to do, essentially, is just allow us to be able to control this camera from our Cinemachine game object. Now what we want to do is we want to make this camera no longer a child of our player. The reason for that is before we were doing some kind of fun, nice, hacky things where we would use the player's position as a way of moving our camera through the world. We're now going to allow Cinemachine to do that work for us by looking and following our player game object. And so we no longer want that. We're also making one little change to our player camera script, which will allow us to choose whether we're using a Cinemachine FreeLook camera and base our rotation on the rotation of the camera itself. If we do this from within, as a child of the player game object, we end up with some really weird results, which are not at all what we want. And so I'm going to also just give this a little more of a generic name here. Since it's no longer a first-person camera, it's just going to be a camera. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go first off to my Cinemachine FreeLook, and I'm going to set this up to just kind of get things moving in the direction I'm interested in. And so the first things I'm interested in here are setting my follow and my look at to point to my player game object. And so I'm just going to drag these in here. There we go. And because we're using a FreeLook camera, you can see that it's set up now with these three rigs that we have, a top, middle, and a bottom rig. And these are going to allow us to be able to control the kind of rotation that we're looking at here when we move our camera around. The FreeLook camera works well with the mouse moving on the screen, both on the X and Y axis to control the position of the camera as you would expect. As we move on the horizontal axis, it allows us to rotate around these rings, and as we move on the y-axis, it will interpolate between these for us along this sort of splined arc and allow us to also continue on the horizontal axis, be able to move around as expected. We can set all of these things here in our Cinemachine FreeLook game object. Now, before we go any further though, what I also want to do is just set this up for the kind of system that we've been developing here in class, which is to go over to my player game object and take a look at my player camera script. So the first thing here is that I have added an option for us to designate when we are using the Cinemachine FreeLook camera. And so I'm going to go ahead and check that. This is really critical. It's going to change the way that we are moving through the space based on the Cinemachine's camera angle. So if we're looking in a direction, we're going to press forward using the W key, and that's going to propel us toward that. If we don't, we're going to sort of move around independently of that and it can create a real mess. The other thing that we're going to do here is we're going to make sure that our player camera is still connected to the appropriate camera. In this case, because we've simply taken the camera out of our player game object and moved it down here to the root of our hierarchy, we're in good shape. If we had multiple cameras in the scene, we may want to try to make sure, well, we would want to make sure that that camera is still the one that we're intending to use to follow around our player. And so I'm going to take a quick look here at the script as we've changed it. Again, we've added the option now to be able to set our mode by setting a public boolean called using Cinemachine FreeLook. And the only other thing that we're doing here that is any different is right here, which is we are taking down in update. We have now nested these things in an if statement, which just checks to see if we are in that Cinemachine FreeLook mode, right? If that has been checked out in the inspector. And if that's the case, we're going to control the rotation of our player game object so that it just matches the camera that we've set here. It matches its rotation on the y-axis. So that way we're always looking in the direction we want to move, and we can just move forward according to that. Now, if this is not checked, if Cinemachine FreeLook is not checked, we revert back to the behavior that we've already established, right? And this would be our first-person camera, potentially a third-person fixed camera if we've set it up that way. So we want to make sure that that stays intact as well, so we can use both. So back to Unity here. So now we can take a look at how things appear. I've got my game view down here below, and I've got my play view here. We can take a look at what happens as I start to move this camera around. You can see we start to spin as I'm moving up and down. I'm moving along the spline, but I'm also rotating, right? So if I'm rotating on that horizontal axis. And once again, I can do this and move my player around. By default, there is some kind of easing here that happens that allows the camera to kind of catch up to me. We can make changes to that if we want to. But I think for right now, for this example, I'm just going to leave it. We're going to focus just on manipulating these three rigs. The other thing here that I want to point out too is that your view may look a little bit different from mine. So you may have an overlay of things that's happening here on the screen. And just remember, if that's the case down in your game view, that you can turn gizmos on and off. Remember too that we have some options with Cinemachine, based on our work with using it in 2D that allow us to turn these game window guides on and off. These game window guides are sometimes really important, right? Like, for example, they help me know that currently my camera is positioned to look at the game object and center it in the middle of my screen. Now, I can use this as a guide for myself to basically say, like, this is just way, way too close. And I can go down here into the orbits section and start to make some changes. Like, so right now, if I'm focusing on the middle ring, I may decide that the radius of 3 is just way, way too close. And I might pull this down just a little bit more like that. Give me, maybe let's set this to like 6. In this case, though, I'm still getting a lot of information here behind my character. And I may want to make some changes to that as well. I may decide that, like, I want this to be tilted a little bit less, right? But it still doesn't help the fact that I'm still situated right in the middle. And so the other thing that we can do is we can go down to the settings for our individual rigs, and here in the middle rig, I can choose to just give myself a little offset on the Y, right? So as I start to drag this here, you can see that I'm dragging it now down this way. And then this just gives me more to look at, right? It's only changing this for my middle rig currently. And so when I go back here and hit play, we can see as I'm rotating, right? As I approach that middle rig, I get that offset. My camera goes behind me so I can see well ahead of me. But as I start to move down, I also get it zooming in. This would be great if I wanted the effect to sort of be like, kind of tucking into me as if I'm looking through my player's view at this point. But in this case, I can also see that I want to make it so that this is changed, right? So largely what I'm seeing here is just the back of my player and not the world. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start getting an idea of what these settings would be. And so let's say, first off, I want to make it so that my bottom rig orbit is, let's say maybe this is 3. And so now let's go down here and see what this looks like. Okay, still a little close, I think, so we'll make it a little bit further out. That's better. I think that's much better. But depending on what we're looking at, right? If the architecture of our space is quite grand and we always want to look up as a way of scanning to see, we might do something a little bit more like this, right? We may pull this camera way out, and then we may take it and again, like sort of create an offset for us to work with. And so I'm gonna do that. So that I'm just looking up a little bit more here. And so now let's see what this looks like, right? Back in the middle, down here at the bottom. Much better. Now we have to watch out sometimes when we make these, how we make these, we can end up with kind of like weird results. You see how I'm out so far that I'm actually clipping this geometry here. So we need to think a little bit about how we're going to plan this. Same with overhead here, right? So my top view, it brings me in nice and tight, which is kind of great because it gives me a good overhead view, but it doesn't really tell me much because it's so heavily cropped. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to set my middle rig, or excuse me, my top rig. I'm going to set the height of this. So let's go like much higher. And let's see how this works. Great. Looks good, yeah. So again, I might need this at certain points just to be able to see where I am. I may do the same thing too, depending on the kind of game that I'm making. I might take that top rig and just apply a little bit of a bias here to just position me a little lower on the screen. Oops, I went the wrong way. This way. Here we go. If I'm less concerned with what's behind me and more concerned with what's in front of me, right? Depends where I want my player's eye to be directed and what I need them to see. In this case, it's probably beneficial because I'm moving forward, that they're able to see ahead just a little bit more, or maybe even a lot more than they are otherwise, right? So maybe I'll move that way down here. Great. Okay, just sort of depends what you're looking for. And that's it for now, right? So this is going to give us a lot of power, a lot of ability to be able to take these scenes that we're creating here and explore them using this really dynamic, wonderful camera.